You are now listening to Thunder Radio, the podcast of the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Centre.
Okay, this is Thunder Radio, a podcast for the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Centre. And I'm guest hosting for Kim Kakikemik today. And I'm here with Niigaan James Sinclair. He's assistant professor at U of M right now, was the department head of Native Studies, writer, editor, activist, commentator, dad. Thanks for coming in.
Bonjour. Hello.
Hey, so a million different titles and stuff that you do. Do you have like a focus for your work, like an overall focus of what you want to achieve or what you want to accomplish?
That's a great question. I started in this thing planning. I want to be a writer. That was really the only thing I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so when I'm a recovering high school teacher, meaning I taught high school here in Winnipeg, and I kind of had plans I had a 40-year career just staring at me in the face, being a drama teacher, English teacher. And then what I jumped into was teaching Native Studies at a high school here in Winnipeg. And I really liked that. I found it really inspiring. So that was my first kind of foray into teaching Indigenous studies and issues involving our people. And then I just wanted to be a writer. I remember I was teaching high school, and there was a guy on staff, another teacher, who wrote one poem in Prairie Fire. And I remember thinking to myself, if he can do it, I can do it. And I never thought I could be a writer. I never thought I was good enough. Actually, I used to send off wads of poems, terrible poems, and to journals and magazines, and everything got rejected. Everything. I remember getting a pile of writing back from a magazine, and they just put a sticky on the front and said, "We don't want this." Literally, that's what they sent it back to me. "We don't want this." I'm surprised they even sent it back, actually. But I just wanted to be a writer. I wanted to learn how to write. And so I read a book called Red on Red, Native American Literary Separatism. And it was by a guy called Craig Womack, who's a Muskogee Creek guy from Oklahoma. And Cherokee, also a Cherokee guy too. And so that changed my life. I remember that book, reading the intro to that book. I read it in Mondragon here in Winnipeg. And I came home and I emailed him that night, and I was living in a little apartment on Corden, getting ready to teach the next morning at Kelvin High School. Mm-hmm. And I emailed him, and he was teaching at Lethbridge. And I said, "I'll do anything to come work with you. I just want to write like you. I just want to learn how to write. Mm-hmm. I just want to learn how to analyze our stories, but also commentate and say interesting things about who we are as people." And he said, "Wait." He emailed me back that night. He said, "Wow. Wait. I'm going to Oklahoma next year. I've got a job in Oklahoma." A number of emails were exchanged that night and the next day. And he said, "Send me your writing." He liked my writing. First person ever liked my writing, really. Him and Marvin Francis, if you remember, Cree poet here. He used to, from Alberta, but used to, be in Winnipeg here. And he said, "Come to Oklahoma. Come work with me in Oklahoma." Now, in the meantime, I had to go get a degree, finish my honors degree, and then go and get into the master's program at Oklahoma to work in, at the time, was the only Native American Literary Studies program where you could it was the only program in North America where you could study Indigenous literature and figure out what makes it click, what makes it work. There was another one at Berkeley, another one at Illinois at the same time, but they weren't as prestigious as the one at Oklahoma. And Craig was amazing. He got me a full ride scholarship at Oklahoma. Wow. Didn't pay a cent to go down there. I got my American permanent residency too through the Jay Treaty when I was going down there. And to make a long story even longer, I always wanted to write and to write about our stories. Mm-hmm. And so that's really been my career goal since then. But since those days, I've had a lot of shiny objects kind of come in my path, and some of it's been doing activism, and some of it's been, of course, becoming a dad. Never planned that. Mm-hmm. And then all the media work that I do, and now administration. I've decided I don't want to be an administrator for sure, but I've been doing that for the past couple of years, heading up the Native Studies program at U of M, and I just want to get back to what I really want to do now. I feel like my career is on a restart at 41 years old. So.
Did you fall into all the media stuff? Like, because you do a ton of it. Are they just reach out to you because of your background and what you've been doing over the past several years in your educational background and your writing?
Well, I think I come by it pretty honestly because, I grew up in the kind of public eye a little bit, being around my dad. So my dad is Senator Murray Sinclair. And I grew up in halls, community halls, friendship centers, the courtrooms. Like my dad literally drove around the province going, as a lawyer and then as a judge, and then later as the commissioner of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. And I came to all of that. I remember the morning that Constable Robert Cross committed suicide. I remember that morning. And I remember being there to hear the hearings, and I remember the media being there. So of course I wasn't commentating in those days, but my dad was. Right. And having a father that's on TV every night gets you to, you're constantly kind of around it, and you hear about it and you think about it. And so I guess I kind of fell into it because that's just the way it was, but it wasn't really interesting to me until I Don't Know More. Like, I didn't really see the purpose of dealing with the mainstream. I was just focusing on, even when I was teaching high school, I was just focused on Indigenous kids, what could I do for them? And at Kelvin, there was only a couple dozen. And pretty soon they all came to my room, and we were having Bannock on Wednesdays. And I started the very first Native Studies group there, and it was just an informal kind of discussion about what's it like being a Native kid at Kelvin. And all those kids now are doing amazing things. Like Shawan Canoe just finished her PhD. She was in that
Kelvin
group.
Too?
Elsa Kickson, who's a mother and is now has worked at NCI Radio, and I can just name them all. Christian, just doing an engineering degree at. I can just list them all off. Yeah. They're amazing, amazing people. We did the very first Native Studies kind of day, or Aboriginal Peoples Day at Kelvin, which was shocking for a mostly white school full of Jewish kids,
Oh, yeah.
And we blew their minds. And part of that was I brought the dead Indians in to come and give a rap show at noon hour.
Oh, that's amazing.
And I think it blew their minds.
Yeah.
But I remember Wob just being a kid having pizza in my room, and
I
didn't really know him at all, and I just sort of I just knew Shawan sort of introduced. There's my brother, and and so anyways, I didn't get really involved in media at all until I Don't Know More, and there was an editor of a small town newspaper in Morris, Manitoba, who published a cartoon and a little editorial about saying that Native people were terrorists because we were acting like terrorists in our own country because we were dancing in a mall. And I don't know what happened to me that day, but that set me off. And for a lot of people, they'll say there's kind of a thing that turns their career, and that for me that was that day. And I immediately took to social media, like most people do now, to sort of express their frustration or their ideas or their reaction to that. And then I said I don't want to stop there because I'd been working so much with treaty and with gift giving. And my book about Ojibwe literature is about the principles that we've always made with other peoples, and peoples that we've both non-human beings that we met, and then human beings that we've met along our journey, and how we create relationships often with extremely different people. And so, how that always is the word that we use to describe gift giving, which is bagjigan or bagajinan, depending on where you stand. And bagajinan is the idea that you set something down. You carry something and then you set it down for someone to share with. And so I wanted to offer him a bagajinan. And even though he was saying these racist, horrible things, and I thought, I could go punch him in the face, and a lot of people I think thought I was going to do that. 6 media trucks followed me out to go to his work.
Yeah.
The media all wanted me to punch him in the face. That's what they wanted to see.
Right.
But I instead brought him Tim Hortons coffee and a donut, because that's a bagajinan. That's what you offer when you, as an Anishinaabe, you offer a gift. And so that was probably the beginning of the media frenzy for me. And since then, it's now been almost 6 years, and I do 5 to 10 interviews on something a week,
Yeah.
and on or an editorial or on a piece. But since I've been department head, I've found I've had very little time to do that, and that's the thing that's really had to give away. I can't do as much of that, and I got to do more of the other helping, put out fires at the university. So.
I want to unpack a couple of things there. First of all, is your dad. How much has he influenced you? Was it just like being around him while he was doing that work, or how much has he directly influenced you? Because I was going to ask you, like, you were a teenager around the time when the AJI was happening. So like, what kind of influence has that had on you on your career direction?
Well, on one level, very profound, but on another level, I've never known anything but, so I don't really know how deeply profound. So, on lots of levels, I've always wanted to not be my dad. So I remember my dad saying to me one time, when are you going to get a real job? And what he really means is, when are you going to be a lawyer? Because for him, being a lawyer, working in justice, working in policy, working in government, that's pretty much the real work. And I work with stories, and I work with analyzing stories. And I remember one day he said, "What do you do there? You just read books all day and talk about them, right?" And I go, "Well, Dad, I teach, and then I write, and then I come up with theories, and then what you hope you inspire other people to do the same, so that that's the principle of who we are." And so my dad is, in many levels, I've tried not to be my dad, and I never wanted to go to law school. In fact, I encourage people to, but I think if you can survive law school, you've survived the most colonial and violent experience you can have in university is going to law school. It's very archaic, and it's built on these racist foundations. And as a lawyer, you've got to grapple with those all the time. Like, at least in literary studies, we can talk about who we are as a people, but in the justice system, you can never talk about who you are as a people. You're always dealing with the racist stuff from hundreds of years ago. So my dad's been very profoundly influential in other ways for me, not professionally, I'd say culturally. And so I've gone to the lodge, Medewan, since I've been about 5. And I've always kind of respected my dad for the work that he's done in the lodge. He's a guy that's gone through a lot in his life. When he was a kid, he wanted to be a priest. That was his dream. That was his goal. And my great-grandmother, who raised him, kind of taught him the way you can ride both the traditional world and also the mainstream, or often the Christian world. And my dad's always done a very good job with that, and I've always admired that and always tried to emulate that. And that's why I'd say half my speaking events are for non-native communities, because that's what I watched growing up. And so I've always appreciated the way my dad can both speak to Indigenous audiences and non-Indigenous audiences. I've always wanted to emulate that, and I've tried to do that. And I've also really appreciated the way my dad's humor. My dad's the best thing my dad ever said to me, I can remember, is the greatest gift you can give to somebody is make them laugh. And that's always been, I've always tried to do that. My dad's always been able to find the brightness in situations, and often the humor. The last thing that my dad's been very influential about is his ability to show kindness and empathy and compassion has been something I've always didn't realize really till the past few years of my life, that I've always recognized that my dad's done that. I can remember when I was a kid, he'd do this all the time. He'd be in the worst mood, or he'd be in a rush to go somewhere, or he'd be busy, but he'd always help people, always. I remember it was like a minus 40 degree night in Winnipeg, and we were driving down Salter, and we were in a rush to go somewhere. My dad was like giving a speech somewhere, or there was a dinner in his honor. So right after he was appointed to the bench, and there was like literally dinners in his honor every 10 minutes, it seemed. And but we were rushing, and we were late, and there were hundreds of people waiting. But my dad was driving up Salter, and there was an old man. I guess he had been passed out, or he slipped on the ice or whatever. anyways, he was quite intoxicated. It was outside of a community center, and my dad stopped the van literally in the middle of traffic, got out, and we were all wondering what the heck's going on. And my dad helped this man into the center. It took him about half an hour, and he just didn't even care that these people were waiting for him. But that's kind of that. That story is been always a way that I've tried to live my life, and yeah.
So your dad wanted you to get into law. I want to talk about that dad the whole time. I'm switching gears here. Do you feel like you've been able to create the kind of change that maybe he wanted from you to do in law through literature and words and stories? What's the power in that, in creating change?
Well, I'm privileged to work in a university, so I see a lot, and I think a lot, and I also study a lot. So one thing I study about is our history as Indigenous people. The most interesting thing to me is there's a book to be written somewhere in here. I don't know if I'll ever do it, but there's certainly a book to be written. The first wave of people that when we were allowed to leave the reserve in the 1960s for the first time as Indigenous people, not as enfranchised Indigenous people, but actually Indigenous people who we could go to university, and we could do so before, but we had substandard, terrible education, and there were so many barriers put into place. But in the 1960s, our first wave are almost unilaterally lawyers. Ovid McCurdy, Mariette Meadmore, Phil Fontaine, Ken Young. These are people who shaped Manitoba, Indigenous Manitoba. Dave Kershane. These are all people who went to school to study law and then became the leaders in our communities. And that should tell you, first off, how remarkably unjust our world was, because we needed advocates and legal advocates so badly. The need was so pressing, but also our sense of responsibility was that our whole job was to engage colonial institutions and fight for every inch that we needed. And as a result, look at the past 50 years of our lives have been a 50-year winning streak of human rights and social justice. And we're still way behind, of course, on all the determinants on treaty rights, everything from treaty rights to advocating whether our duty to consult, right? We're still way behind, and Canada's, Indian Act is still here. So really, how far have we really come? However, every win that we've gotten is because of the brave work of Indigenous people in law. And you could sort of look at that similarly in teaching, in health, in social work. I see my generation, which is not certainly a millennial generation, but it's kind of Generation X. My generation was one of the first where we could be dreamers. And we could go back to how we really were, which is that we didn't have to be in a position of constantly reacting, but we could be proactive. My daughter's generation, I see as embodying that. You can just see it on social media now.
Oh, yeah.
People are not just reacting, although I see the generation now as the generation that doesn't take any crap from anyone. They're saying, no, I'm Indigenous, and I got no worries about that. I got no insecurities about that. My generation still had that. I can still remember telling people I was Spanish growing up. Right?
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
And I think our generation still had that struggle, but we began to see more because of the work of our parents, who had been on the front lines of Oka and had been on the front lines of the occupation at Kenora in 74, or the opposition to the White Paper in the 1970s. Because of the work of our parents all the way up until the 1990s, they gave us the opportunity to dream. They opened the door for us. We stood in the doorway, and our children, I see as they're now looking at the world in a totally different way and that's just 3 generations. That's remarkable. The change that's happened in our lifetime is remarkable. And I don't think my grandfather could have seen it. My grandfather came from a very different world. My father has the opportunity to see the beginning of it, but it's really us that are going to see, like you can see it every day in the Indigenous literary world. There's a new writer coming out every week. There's a new poet, or there's a new TV show, or so I think the question that you're asking was, I forgot.
Oh, I guess what we're getting at though is that those people who are involved in law and professional occupations, Indigenous peoples, really laid the foundation for people like you and I to be able to create the change that we're doing in the arts.
Well,
right?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So the dreaming that I see now is making change at a faster rate than the incremental stuff but the incremental stuff had to happen. Mm-hmm. We had to have the Calder decision and the Chicoltlan decision, and we had to have all of those work in law for us to be here. Mm-hmm. And but like, for instance, if I worked for about a year to get the Winnipeg Jets to acknowledge treaty at their home games. It didn't take very much.
Right.
And it was because of the work of people who have worked on treaty, who have worked on acknowledgement and recognition, and have worked on land rights, that's now, and legal frameworks of relationships, and now the Winnipeg Jets, I just have to nudge them. Mm-hmm. But the reason I'm able to get in the room with them is because of all the other work I do, the writing and the speaking, and so for me, it's all a spectrum. It's like I'm able to get work done quicker. And perhaps, but I'm only here on a big scale. But I'm only here because of the work that has been done in the 1980s and 1990s.
So I want to talk about your writing a little bit. Well, I guess there's two areas for you in literature. There's writing, and then there's really editorial work, which you've been doing. And one of them has been the Daybway series at Highwater Press. Where do you see like that work fitting into what you're trying to accomplish and where you're heading towards? Because that's an ongoing series. So you want to talk a little bit about Daybway? And
yep. So, the Daybway series was just my idea of giving writers I know opportunities that they otherwise were not getting at the time. So I've often wondered now, in the world that we live right now in 2017, whether the series is still relevant, because in the world of 2011, it was still a world of there was very little opportunities for Indigenous writers. You had to go fight your own way. Mm-hmm. You had to go into rooms and convince people that your books were important and that there was a market for them. I can remember when you first started, people didn't like. I remember actually thinking, who's going to buy that book? Who's going to buy 7 Generations?
I thought that too.
And like, who's like the Helen Betty Osborne graphic novel you did? You had to basically make a market, which you bought it yourself, right? Mm-hmm. Those are free copies, and that's what we were doing until the 1990s, until 2000s, as far as I know. It was only in the 2000s we began to sort of see a market that's being created, a local market here in Manitoba. And I think in many ways 7 Generations was that kind of breakthrough, one of those breakthrough books where the mainstream was interested. And so the Daybway series was kind of my opportunity to say, well, I think there's more out there. And I know people. I know Catarica Lindsay Dam has a manuscript right now. I know that Leanne Simpson's got a manuscript right now. I know that Chelsea Vowell's got a manuscript soon to be happening at that time, which is in blogs. And I said, okay, so let me phone up friends of mine and say, how can we make these books happen? And but now I think that there's actually, it's pretty easy to get published. That's what I think. I see manuscripts all the time, especially self-publications. Mm-hmm. I see people publishing their own books or publishing, with smaller presses. Or I get calls from Penguin now. Penguin calls me. I don't call Penguin. That's a different world than it was in 2011. I couldn't imagine being in a room with Penguin, and I was in one last year, and it was because of Wab Kanu's book. They see a market there. They asked Wab, well, name me some writers that would be out there, and next thing you know, you're in a room in Toronto talking to people, right? And there's so many opportunities now with books and publications. I wonder if the Daybway series is still relevant. Our approach has been with that is to have Indigenous editors work with Indigenous writers. And I think that model is still important because there's not enough opportunities like that. certainly with the Indigenous publishers in the country, they're constantly struggling to be able to put out quality texts and to have a infrastructure there to build. And I think there still really isn't a self-sustaining Indigenous publisher in the country doing extremely well. There's some that are making it, but often living off grants still. And well, I think, Thetis is an example out of Penticton,
Right.
Or Kegadance in Cape Croker. So Cattery, Echowenzi Dam has Kegadance, or Thetis out in Penticton, which is run through a number of people, but Greg Younging is in charge, I think, right now, and Jeanette Armstrong formerly. I think there's always a market for that, and there's always going to be a market for Indigenous editors working and formatters and everything from indexers. Like, I remember I've had fights with Portage and Main, good people, do great work with that you've published, I published with them, but there's still battles sometimes involving things like including Indigenous languages or titles or covers, for example, or where are we gonna market things, where are we gonna set up book tables, where are we gonna put our energy for marketing. And so with Indigenous publishers, it's not that they know it all, but often you don't have to have some of those battles. And so I think there'll always be a market for Indigenous publishers, and I'm encouraged by mainstream publishers, but I also if I were to give advice to any writer that goes to a big mainstream publisher, I'd say just be patient, because they're going to make a lot of errors that an Indigenous publisher won't make. It's only now working for 7-8 years with Portage and Main where I don't have to have arguments about certain things involving books and relationships with Indigenous writers or setting up infrastructure. And it's because they get it now. They see a purpose and they see a market. We don't have to argue about including Indigenous languages in books.
Yeah. So I guess just like trying to focus in all the experience you've had and everything we talked about, and talking about wanting to kind of reset in your own career. Where do you want to be heading in terms of what you're writing right now? Like, are you working on anything right now? And has that changed your focus at all?
Yeah. So I'm working on my book right now. My book's been overdue for a year, so it's got to be in this summer period. And it's my book about Ojibwe writing, about an Anishinaabe writing. And so there still has yet to be published an Anishinaabe study about Anishinaabe writing. And that shocks me, because we're one of the most we've had writers just in English for over 250 years. For the early sermons, for example, some of the Ojibwe writers, actually more like 200 years. So if you were to just look at the Ojibwe literature, there's really not been an Ojibwe specific study. There's been a number of dissertations and studies, essays, and so on. There's been some work by Gerald Visner, and there's been work by Kim Blazer, but sort of a book-length study about Ojibwe literature, and I'll be one of the first to publish that, and that's exciting.
Yeah.
There's, because if I want a study that can look at Kakawakanabe, who is Peter Jones, who was an Ojibwe missionary in the 19th century, alongside Wayne Keon, an Ojibwe poet in the 1950s and 60s, and alongside Leanne Simpson, who writes nonfiction today and some fiction. I want something that can look at the way that Anishinaabe look at writing and think of it that way. And so that'll be coming out next year. And I've got so many book ideas on the go, but then of course all these very interesting shiny objects come in my path. One is a graphic novel anthology, which you're also involved in with Portage and Main Press, on sort of envisioning both Canada, but more than Canada, for the past couple hundred years, of what that experience has been like as an Indigenous person. And so I'm part of that anthology. I'm also part of a whole bunch of different other books that are out there. So I've committed to an essay on resurgence and revitalization that's coming out of Victoria. So that's I'm working on that. and then working on an appropriation piece for your book. So there you go. And if you add it all up, a lot of these things are my ideas involving pieces today are usually building on an idea I had 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. For me, I'm a very slow developer of ideas. So things I'm working on right now, I was thinking of in 2007, 2005, 2003. Mm-hmm. And probably things I'm thinking about now I'll be working on in 2027.
Yeah. Are you more interested in like nonfiction than fiction? It sounds like that's more of the work that you're working on right now.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's like almost like a blurred line between the two now. I don't think there's much difference between fiction and nonfiction, to be honest.
Well, if you've studied nonfiction and fiction, you'd say there never has been any difference between the two, because fiction's always full of reality, and
absolutely,
and nonfiction is full of fiction. Like you've always exaggerating who you are, seeing yourself in a funny way or whatever. So there's never really been a definite line. And what I tell my students is, in Manitowabo, which is the anthology I did of Manitoba Indigenous writing, for me that's all one literary tradition. That's an Indigenous literary experience of Manitoba, and whether it be Louis Riel's speeches or letters way back in the day, or whether it be the songs of Wab Canoe, or whether it be the poetry or the novels of Beatrice Maussonier or whatever. For me, that's all one way you can look at storytelling and our traditions. And whether we sing a song in the lodge, or whether we're telling a story between a mother and a daughter, these are all things that are interrelated, and they have similar principles within it. They're not the same, obviously, but our principles of literary traditions are what makes us really the best parts of who we are as Indigenous people. Yeah.
Do you think that's making a difference with non-Indigenous Canadians, like having all this work out there right now?
Yeah.
I feel like I see that, and I wonder what your take is on that, because I feel like Canadians in general are very interested in really knowing, and now that we are pushing out more materials, I feel like there's an appetite for that, and I feel like it is making a difference. I want to know what you think.
Yeah. Well, my position is that Canadians are experiencing a tremendous amount of trauma. And if you look at all the symptoms of trauma, everything from depression to lashing out to defensiveness are symptoms of trauma. That's when people experience an emotionally traumatic event. And for me, waking up from 150 years from the story that you've been told about Canada as being this syrupy sweetness flag, involving the merits of genocidal maniacs from the 19th century, hell-bent on killing every single Native family, community, and nation they came upon. Discovering that's the story, or that's the story that you haven't been told, or that you've only been told one part of 1 inch of the flag, not the whole flag, I think it's traumatic. And so for me, every story we tell, every song we sing, every piece that we publish, whether it be in a newspaper or a novel, or whether we continue our traditions in the oral tradition, changes that narrative, exposes Canadians to a narrative that broadens their perspective of who they are as much as we express who we are. And that's traumatic. That's hard. And so we shouldn't be surprised when people freak out and lash out sometimes, and start running an appropriation prize in a national media, because for me, those are people who have been taught to be deluded. They're not inherently deluded.
Right.
And so that's the kind of impact I think our stories are making. But at the same time, we're not defined by non-Indigenous people. We tell our stories not for them. We tell our stories because we are who we are, and we tell our stories to grow who we are as a people. And so every story we tell is also a moment of resurgence and revitalization, a remaking of ourselves. We're all constantly remaking ourselves as we are. The Anishinaabe means, one of the translations is the spontaneous people, and spontaneity comes always with cause, right? There's always a purpose. And so when you're remaking yourself, you're telling that story. That's what remakes it. That's what remakes other people. It's like a constant series of remakings. And our stories do that. And that's the awesome thing about who we are is that we've never stopped that. Like whether it be during the times of the Indian Act or during the time of residential school, or whether it be the early era of the Bigot Commission in the 1840s, we were always telling people who we were. It's whether they were listening or whether they were reading or whether they were literate or not to understand us. Because for me, Canadians are illiterate. We're the ones who are literate. It's Canadians who are illiterate to understanding who we are and who they are. And they're only now waking up to that. And it's not easy. You got to work with them.
But an effect of all that is generating awareness in Canadians. Like maybe that's not the purpose of why we tell stories. We tell stories to tell them, but an effect of that is to educate the general public on history and also contemporary issues. How reconciliation happens is a difficult question to answer. But I wonder, I guess what my last question would be was, what does it mean to you? What does reconciliation mean to you? And what role do books play in reconciliation?
Yeah, so, I mean, I lecture around the country about this, and I particularly talk to teachers and students about reconciliation. And the first thing I always say is, if you don't know what reconciliation is for you, then there's no way you can talk about it in terms of a government, or you can't talk about it in terms of a school. You certainly can't talk about it in terms of a curriculum. Reconciliation, you have to figure out what it is for you. And everyone's going to be at a different level. Everyone's going to be at a different position because we all look at the tree differently. Nobody can ever see all of the tree. You can only see a part of it. And so reconciliation is just, what does it mean for you today? And it likely has something to do with relationships. It may not always, but likely has something to do with your relationships. Not always with Indigenous people, because reconciliation, if it only involves Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, really doesn't matter if we have nothing to breathe or we have nothing to eat or we can't drink the water. So the land has to play a part. Our animal relations have to play a part. Our love has to play a part. The way we see our bodies has to play a part. All of these things come into a sense of reconciliation. So all of us, we need everyone working in all directions. We need transgender, two-spirit people working in the area of reconciliation that they're most interested in. We need young boys, 3 years old, like the guy who's involved in my life, thinking about reconciliation. We need elders thinking about reconciliation. And if everyone comes up with their own definition of what it means, then we have a movement. And from that, and that's where books come in. Because I think the more books, the better. The more writing, the better. The more stories, the better. Not all of our stories belong in books, and not all of our songs belong on CDs, you know. We all need to be telling our versions of who we are, our stories of our experiences, our songs about our nations, in an inclusive, respectful way that not steps on others, but also joins the conversation about reconciliation. Promotes relationships, doesn't end them. Creates more life, or what, Minoba Madzuin is the way that we see life, right? And that's the goal of life. More life is begat from other life. We don't create more life by ending life. So the best life is when the most life is created. So that for me is reconciliation. Reconciliation has to be something that builds life, that creates more life. It's not creating money. It's not creating power. And it's certainly not creating more hydroelectric dams. It's a life in which as many people and non-human beings, our relatives, which really matter, our human lives are important, but are certainly not at the apex. We're only one part of a chain of a network. And our life is better when everyone else is better around us. When the bears are healthy, when the water's healthy, when the air is healthy. That's what reconciliation will look like.
Niigaan, thanks for coming in today.
Miigwech, thank you very much.